So we have done epithelial tissue. We have walked through all of our connective tissues. We only have two tissues left, nervous tissue and muscle tissue. Is everybody okay with our connective tissues? 4 different kinds.
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so the next tissue, our third tissue we're going to go over is nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is a type of tissue that makes up the brain, the spinal cord, and all the nerves that run throughout your body. We call them peripheral nerves. They might run down your arms or down your legs. The main function of your nervous tissue is regulation and control. It regulates and controls your body's functions. So things like movement, even breathing and your heart rate are regulated by things like nervous impulses. Now, in our nervous tissue, there's 2 kinds of cells. One type of cell is called a neuron. Hang on, I'm gonna get this. There we go. Neurons are special cells. They're specialized, and their job is that they send the impulses. So they have a membrane potential, and they have the ability to conduct an electrical impulse. So these are very special cells. Neurons, to me, under a microscope, look kind of like smushed bugs. So they sort of have these branchy processes. They do have a nucleus. They have these small branchy processes and one really long process, typically. Now, the other kind of cell that we have the other kind of cell that we have are called neuroglia. Sometimes we also call these glial cells. Okay, it's the same thing. Neuroglia are not conducting cells. They do not conduct electrical impulses. They do not send signals. They are not there for your brain to communicate with an area of your body or vice versa. They send no motor impulses. They get no sensory impulses. That's not their job. They are non-conducting cells. The job of neuroglia is simply to support. They are there to support your neurons. They make sure that neurons stay healthy. They make sure that neurons have a blood supply. They insulate neurons, but they do not send signals. These are actually so important that about half the mass of your brain is made of these supporting neuroglia. So that's huge. What we typically see is that for one neuron, you'll have 10 neuroglia around it, supporting it. Okay, so even though they're not sending signals, they're still really important in your nervous tissue. So this is an image from the brain of your nervous tissue. And so you can see things like these big cells that look like smushed bugs under here with these long processes. Those are our neurons. And then, I don't know if y'all can see these teeny tiny little dots in the background. Those are the nuclei of the neuroglia. Those are our supporting cells. Okay. All right, the last kind of tissue that we're going to do in chapter 4 is muscle tissue. We have 3 kinds of muscle that we'll walk through. First, I want to tell you a little bit about muscle. One is that it's very cellular. There are a ton of cells in your muscle tissue. It has a fabulous blood supply. And the job of muscle is that it contracts. So it provides some type of movement. Whether we're talking about movement you can see on the outside or movement on the inside, like your heart is helping to move blood, or your smooth muscle, which lines your hollow organs, is helping to propel substances through the inside of your body. So we have three kinds that we'll walk through: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. So skeletal muscle is the one we're going to start with. Skeletal muscle, under a microscope, the cells are really long. So they're these super long cells. They can be up to 1 meter in length. The cells have, each cell, each skeletal muscle cell is multinucleated. I'm going to star that. You are going to see that on an exam. There will be a question about which type of muscle tissue is multinucleate. The only one is skeletal muscle. And the other thing is, when you look at skeletal muscle under a microscope, you see these little striations. So where do we find skeletal muscle? Attached to the skeleton. Okay, so it is attached to your skeleton. It uses your bones as levers, and it pulls on those bones to provide movement. And the big function of your skeletal muscle is that it's controlling voluntary movement. It is the only type of muscle that is under voluntary control, meaning your brain can tell your skeletal muscle to move and contract. So I can say, hey, I want to pick up my drink and take a drink. My brain has told my skeletal muscles to do that. It's voluntary. This is skeletal muscle under a microscope. And what we're looking at, so you can see like right here, just circled it, that would be one skeletal muscle cell. It is so long, it's running off the field of view of the microscope. So these cells are really, really long. The other thing you're going to notice are all these nuclei within that one cell. So again, it's multinucleate. And then the last thing you'll notice is all these striations, these little bands in there. Now notice I told you that your muscle is very cellular. So you can see that it is one muscle cell next to another, next to another, next to another. They're very parallel with each other. Now cardiac muscle, to me, looks kind of similar to skeletal muscle in that it's still striated, right? It still has these little striations, but it has a couple of differences that make it really easy to identify. One is that instead of the cells being all parallel, you'll see a little more branching where the cell will kind of branch off. The other is that it is not multinucleate. It is uninucleate. The only multinucleated muscle cells are skeletal muscles. And then the last one, and this is the big one, this is the one that I think helps you identify cardiac muscle the best. And that is that it has something called an intercalated disc. These are discs between the cells that allow your cardiac muscle cells to communicate with each other, and it allows the cells to contract as a whole unit. That's really important because if your cardiac muscle cells are not contracting as a unit so that the whole area of the heart can contract and propel blood, what you get in your heart is something called fibrillation. And it's where the heart muscle looks like it's quivering. And it's all those cells are contracting all alone by themselves. You pump no blood when that happens. The heart is not effective at moving blood when it's fibrillating. This is why if you've ever watched like Grey's Anatomy, or if you've ever taken a CPR class, we have things called external automatic defibrillators. And these are things where, you know, the paddles where they rub them together and they say clear, and then they shock the patient. They are defibrillating the patient. They are getting that patient out of fibrillation. They want the cells to start contracting in unison again, so you can start moving blood. So these intercalated discs are really important in getting your heart cells to contract together. So where do we find your cardiac muscle? We find it in the heart, right? It's in the walls of the heart, and its job is to move blood through your body. It generates a blood pressure, so it truly helps to get that blood circulating through the entire body. And again, it is involuntary. You know, thank goodness we do not have to remember to make our heart contract and beat. I have too many things already that I'm thinking about. I can't remember that. So that is involuntary. This is an image of cardiac muscle under the microscope. And so again, what you're going to notice in terms of similarities with skeletal muscle is you have these little striations in here. But to me, the distinguishing characteristic are these bands, these intercalated discs. Another thing that you might notice is you might notice that you don't see a lot of nuclei, right? It's not multinucleate, it's a uninucleate. So you see a few nuclei kind of scattered around, but not a bunch. And then you also see a lot of branching. So instead of having this nice long cell, you'll see the cells branch. Now our last type of muscle is smooth muscle. Smooth muscle gets its name because it's very smooth in appearance. It has no striations. And the cells look different. To me, the cells of smooth muscle are spindle-shaped, and they have a central nucleus. So these are also uninucleate. Where we find this type of muscle is our hollow organs. So in the GI tract, like in the intestines, you find it in the stomach, you find it in the esophagus, you find it in the urinary tract, propelling urine. You find it in the uterus, helping to either deliver a baby or shed the uterine lining. And the function truly is just to propel substances along that internal passageway. That process has a name. It's called peristalsis. This is the process of propelling substances along an internal passageway. And just like cardiac muscle, you know, it's involuntary. So again, you know, if you think about eating your breakfast this morning, and you know, you have your bowl of Cheerios and you chew them using skeletal muscle, that's voluntary. You swallow using skeletal muscle, it's voluntary. And then you don't think about them again until they come out the other end, where you have skeletal muscle around the anal canal. So all the way propelling through your body, it's all smooth muscle. You're not thinking about it. So this is an image, this is of the GI tract, looking at that smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is really hard to get a good image of under a microscope. And so you can see, I'll kind of draw a line here. So you can see that sort of spindle-shaped cell, right? So that is our smooth muscle. You can see the nuclei right in the middle. Okay, so this is a great picture over here on the left, just kind of showing you those spindle-shaped cells. So those are the 4 tissues that we've walked through, right? So we have gone through, let's see. So we have gone through our epithelial tissue, right, as a covering or a lining. We've gone through all of our connective tissues. So again, remember we have our connective tissue proper, we have our cartilage, we have our bone, we have our blood. Right? All of these come from mesenchyme. We have nervous tissue. And we have our muscle. And we have our different kinds of muscle. We have skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. So on an exam, I will ask you general characteristic questions about the tissues. It'll be questions like, which of the following types of muscle tissue is multinucleate? Right? And you would tell me that's skeletal muscle. Or I might ask you a question where I would say, which of the following types of tissues has chondrocytes and elastic fibers? Well, you know chondrocytes are in cartilage, and of our 3 kinds of cartilage, the one with a lot of elastic fibers is elastic cartilage. So I'll give you characteristic questions. It'll be multiple choice questions. I am not going to put a lot of images on the lecture exam for your tissues. You will get images on a lab exam. So this week in lab, your lab PDF document for chapter 4 that you're completing has images from all the different kinds of tissues that you have to be able to identify. So on a lab exam, I'll have one of those images from that lab PDF document that will be up, and I'll say, identify this tissue, okay? And so where I'm gonna have you do more visual identification will be on the lab portion. Where I'm gonna be asking you a little bit more about the structures and the characteristics of these tissues will be on the lecture portion.